This course discusses the requirements of legislation such as the Safeguarding Vulnerable Groups Act 2006 and how the requirements relate to people who may occasionally work on premises, such as schools, where vulnerable groups are present. After completing this course, you will be aware of the requirements of safeguarding legislation, be aware of the requirements of the disclosure barring service, have an understanding of appropriate behavior when working near or around vulnerable groups. In this module, we will look at safeguarding, DBS checks, and the code of conduct for working with vulnerable groups. Introduction. There are many situations where you may find yourself working in an environment that requires extra vigilance. Most commonly, these environments include working with or around vulnerable groups such as children, young people, and adults whose circumstances make them vulnerable. There is a framework in place to protect these vulnerable groups, commonly referred to as safeguarding. We will consider the safeguarding framework, highlighting the aspects you need to consider when tendering for or working in environments where you may come into contact with vulnerable groups. We will also consider what additional actions you should take to minimize any personal liabilities or risks when working in vulnerable situations. This course is a basic awareness course designed for people who occasionally work in vulnerable situations. Background. Government guidance is mainly concerned with those who are employed to work directly with vulnerable groups, such as in education or social welfare settings. But the principles behind the guidance provides best practice advice for any setting where there are adults who work with or around vulnerable people. The guidance is equally relevant for those who come into contact with children and young people on an ad hoc or irregular basis for short periods of time, such as building contractors, maintenance companies, delivery personnel, and the like. Premises managers are also duty-bound under general health and safety legislation to have effective systems in place to ensure the safety and well-being of the users of the building when building works, routine maintenance, and emergency repairs are undertaken at their premises. The main forms of legislation that underpin the guidance are Safeguarding Vulnerable Groups Act 2006, the Care Act 2014, Child Care Act 2006. Terms and definitions. In its simplest terms, safeguarding can be defined as keeping people safe from harm, such as illness, abuse, or injury. People who are potentially more vulnerable include children and adults who cannot look after or protect themselves for reasons such as having a physical, sensory, or learning disability, having mental health problems, are older, or live in a care home or alone. The legal definition of harm, as set out in the Safeguarding Vulnerable Groups Act 2006 and in the Disclosure and Barring Service Regulations, says, we consider harm in its widest context. Harm may include sexual harm, physical harm, financial harm, neglect, emotional harm, psychological harm, verbal harm. This is not an exhaustive list, and harm may take many different forms.